Okay, so the purpose of today, so this is trauma-informed practice in youth work, and the purpose of today is so as 42nd Street, we've also been asked to develop a practice paper that encompasses all that we're going to be training about today. So what we want to do is bring that practice paper alive so the two match up. We've also been asked to do a podcast that we've done with a couple of young people. So again, when you get the opportunity, please do listen to that as well. And the three components all marry up. What we want to do is bring that practice paper alive by discussing real life scenarios. We want to develop an understanding of what's behind a young person's behaviour. We want to move away from this kind of narrative of mad, bad, dangerous when young people present in distress, and start to kind of get a real sense of what's happened and what is potentially still happening. We want to discuss trauma-informed strategies, and I guess that's the key. What we want to leave you with today is hope, and that's why we do what we do. If we didn't have hope, if we didn't believe things would be different, we wouldn't be doing what we're doing. So that's what we want to leave you with today is hope, and alongside that is some strategies. What we also want to talk about is compassion fatigue. You know, we all do this work because of our own passion, perhaps our own life experiences. But what we have to also acknowledge is if we're looking at trauma in young people, we also have to look at trauma in ourselves. And what that can lead to is something that we call compassion fatigue. So again, we're going to explore that a little bit as well. In terms of our contract today, obviously we're talking about confidentiality. This is about a safe space, a shared space. I know that we said that we're recording. So what I'd really like you to think about is if you are sharing people's stories, that you don't use young people's names and you don't use identifying features, but we don't want you to stop kind of exploring and being able to kind of, like I said, be curious and ask those questions. We want to respect each other. We're going to have different opinions, and that's okay. That's how we can become to a shared understanding, by recognising what the differences are. I want to remind you to put your mics on mute. You've all got them on already, just so that doesn't interfere with any noise in the background kind of thing. We want you to participate as much as possible. This is about your learning, not just us teaching. So please, like I said, in the chat, put your hand up, shout out, whatever you do. If you don't understand something, ask, be curious. If we can't provide that kind of space, how do we provide that to young people? Look after yourself. We're talking about trauma. Trauma impacts on all of us in one way or another. So please do look after yourself. We're going to have boundaries throughout the session, and I guess the important thing around boundaries is when we're working with trauma and young people, one of the most important things we can give them is boundaries, because with boundaries comes trust and it comes safety. So within that, what we're going to do is have time boundaries. So that'll mean things like we'll turn off the screen for a little while and go and get a coffee, that kind of thing. Okay, is that's kind of everything around housekeeping today. Is there anything you need to check in with me? Anything you want to ask, or should we move on to the training? Okay, my role is very much going to be here to support Katrina and to encourage the discussion as well. I may write things in the chat to get you to think as we're going along, but I'm going to hand you over to Katrina, who's going to kind of share her knowledge with us all.
Okay. Queen, do you want to put the PowerPoint up?
It would help, wouldn't it, Katrina?
Whilst Queen is doing that, I'll just start to explain. So initially what I want to talk about is actually what is trauma? What is this thing that we're talking about? What is this word that we're bandying around at the moment? Okay, and Dan Siegel, who's quite big in trauma, and he really thinks about children and young people. And what he said was the simplest way of defining trauma is that it's an experience we have that is overwhelming our capacity to cope. Yeah. So what that means is if you this stuff in the practice paper about ACEs. This is the hook. Sorry, you can't share.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. It says when I try and share, it says that the host has disabled participant screen sharing, but I thought he'd made me the host.
Yeah, let me see if I can do it. Yeah, can everyone see that?
Yeah. Do you want to change it to, slideshow? Sorry, Katrina, you're going to have to do that then. Are you okay with that?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, it's
Lots to
okay.
think about. Yeah.
Jumped.
Karina, you should be the co-host now. I think I've done that.
It's okay. Katrina started sharing.
Fine, yeah,
Oh, cool.
yeah. Sorry, so the simplest way of defining trauma is that it's an experience that we have that overwhelms our capacity. Yeah. What I really want to say here is it doesn't mean that all overwhelming experiences are traumatic. Yeah. So if we think about, doing 10 GCSEs in the space of 2 weeks, that to me sounds overwhelming, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily traumatic for the young person. Yeah. So this is about kind of when you feel like your ability to react, your ability to protect yourself has been overwhelmed. Yeah. So so that's the idea. That's the simplest way of defining trauma. Okay. It's almost like not being able to respond to a threat. Yeah. Okay. What I'd like to say as well is that in terms of experiences, two people could experience the same thing, and one might experience it as traumatic and one might not. And that's to do with people's history. That's to do with the situation. If one person has their kind of safe person with them, then they know that they've got someone to connect with, but the other person might experience that and be completely alone, and that's when they feel completely overwhelmed. So I think it's just about really understanding that trauma is not this thing of like, everyone experiences it the same, and it is literally about our kind of ability to respond. Okay. So we were going to do Menti, Karina, but do you think we'd just have a discussion in terms of what?
Yeah, I think so. I think that works better.
Okay, so in terms of kind of overwhelming experiences that you might be hearing about from young people, and what I'd say is, put this in the chat or mute and just let's have a discussion. What kind of things are you hearing about? What kind of things are young people telling you about where you're kind of you're sensing that feeling of overwhelm?
Did you want us to come on microphone as well? Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Shall I go for it? I think I'm fairly new to Kids of Colour, but I think for me in the short time that I've been at Kids of Colour, some of the most common experiences that I've come into contact with some of our young people is just the overwhelm of powerlessness. So recently, for example, I was talking to a group of young girls at a school where they're experiencing ongoing racism from pupils, from teachers, from the whole structure of the school really, and got in contact with us because they were at a bit of a wit's end with it, because raising the incidents wasn't necessarily resulting in action being taken, or they felt like the action taken was kind of just quite dismissive. So there was therefore like a fear of raising it to be dealt with, and a lack of trust in the school. So there was also a lot going on for those young people of how that then impacted on themselves in terms of questioning their authenticity and feeling guilty for not challenging stuff. So there was a lot there, and it felt like from some of my experiences over the past few months, that's quite a common thing, that young people are experiencing the sense of powerlessness against the force of racism and not really having a lot of agency to do anything about it.
So what I'm hearing is like there's young people in school, they're experiencing racism. Essentially what racism is saying to you is you are not okay in our eyes. Yeah, you don't matter as much as we do, sort of thing. And then what's worse, it sounds like, is that the school is then validating what they're experiencing in terms of, well, it's not really that important. So I can really understand the powerlessness that comes with that, because you're at school, this is what you're told: don't react, go to the teacher, and then the teachers go in, well, we don't see this as important. So it's impacting on their ability to respond, because they're like, well, actually the adults need to respond in this situation and they're not.
Yeah.
Any other
Yeah, is there any other experiences, any other overwhelming experiences that you've either for yourselves or that people are bringing to you?
I think another one that has come up a lot, because obviously we do a lot about policing, especially at the moment, is the over-policing of young people, both in schools and like out on the streets as well. Having to, I guess, I think some of these kids feel, obviously they don't have any control of these things because they're being unfairly stopped and searched and unfairly labelled. And then in schools as well, the language being used towards pupils. Stereotypes being perpetuated about like young Black kids being part of gangs, and like quite aggressive, overly sexual language being used towards young girls, such as like the word slut to like describe the way that they look and stuff like that. And that's coming from like members of staff and school-based police officers, people who are supposed to, in theory, be there to protect you. So I think those are two that really stand out for me.
Yeah, I had a real reaction to that. I thought you were going to say other young people, and then when you're saying staff and police, I had a real reaction to that because, yeah, I can't imagine the level of power that comes with that. Yeah,
And the how that continues, because those young people are in school for 5 years if it's high school. So where's the respite? Where's the escape? So when you're thinking of trauma, it's that continual traumatizing, and young people continually having to find ways of managing that, isn't it? But where is the safety? Where do they get their safety from? Where do they get their hope from? You know, very challenging, very challenging.
and it must be hard for you because in some ways they're coming to you for some hope.
Yeah,
You can imagine you're coming against those barriers as well.
I think obviously it's always difficult, especially when, you know, you have your own experiences of being stereotyped and you know, obviously like racism in its many forms, and then it's as like, you know, seeing young people who are maybe like 5-6 years younger than you go through the same thing. It's definitely like, you know, obviously it's a very emotional thing, but I think we have quite a good support network at Kids of Colour for being able to like talk about those things. So I feel like that's been positive. I've never felt too overwhelmed by it, and I feel like we've been able to support these kids in the best way possible, and hope to carry on supporting them.
Yeah. Okay. Would you know, in terms of my definition of trauma, and I suppose I'm just hearing about what the young people are experiencing, and you know, one of the things that ACEs say is prejudice and discrimination is a trauma, is a traumatic experience. We're talking about trauma here, aren't we? In terms of what these young people are experiencing, it is out and out trauma, isn't it? And then what I can imagine is if there's other factors that are going on for those young people outside of school as well, we're talking about young people that must be really struggling with you know, their feelings and what you know, what's going on for them at the moment.
Yeah, I think, oh, sorry, Lisa, go for it.
Hi, I just had a bit of a, I don't know, like question statement. Trauma, I think, is a very sort of powerful word to kind of comprehend and hear in itself. And I think a lot of the time, you know, obviously sitting here from a more professional experience, yes, the experiences that a lot of ourselves or young people have gone through from their like racial prejudice experiences is trauma and are traumatic. But because we've not sort of accepted that word as much, I guess, in society or amongst those young people, I mean, I've never used the word trauma to a young person. I guess I'm trying to understand how to narrate that better to young people, that is what their experience is. And I don't know if I can imagine that, you know, saying what you've gone through with trauma sort of puts a bit of an understanding to their experience, rather than just always, you know, pushing it to the side and calling it frustration, or just saying that's really sad, and, you know, that's really bad and that shouldn't be going on. I just, how best do we approach letting a young person know that their experience is traumatic, rather than allowing them to just accept that that's just how the world is, and it's annoying that that's just how the world is. I don't know if that's making sense.
No, it's a really good question, Lisa. You know, I think for me, and we cover this a bit later, but for me, I don't necessarily name this with young people. I don't, you know, I think it's about really validating young people's experiences. If they're not using the word trauma, I don't think we necessarily have to. What I think trauma-informed practice is seeing it through the lens of trauma. So for you, Lisa, it might be about you recognizing, you know, and we'll talk about obviously the impact of trauma on the young person. It's recognizing the impact for the young person and how that might shape their behavior, shape how they see themselves. But I think if you want to, you know, I think it's about kind of knowing when it's right, you know. And I've been in sessions with young people where I'm, you know, not necessarily about, you know, trauma, but just kind of, well, I suppose it is trauma, but at the time I was thinking, this is abuse, you know, this is emotional abuse. But what I knew was at the time, they were so protective of their parents that they were like, you know, if I started naming that, it would have an adverse impact on them. So I think it's about, for us as professionals, it's just kind of seeing what's going on and knowing that that is trauma, as opposed to using the word with the young person. But I think, you know, I suppose if you're doing any kind of social action stuff, you might want to bring that in, because that's about kind of going, actually this word is being used more, and actually we need to name racial abuse as trauma, because what people do is go, oh, racial abuse, and oh, it's really bad that that happens, and it's a bit kind of dismissed. But I think if we use the word trauma, I think in certain circles it's like, oh, actually, okay, I'm starting to understand this, and if you can explain why it's traumatic as well, that's brilliant. So I'd say you decide when that feels right. Did that answer your question, Lisa?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. So this section is kind of just to kind of really get a sense of, you know, kind of what kind of behaviours are we working with? Yeah. So I'm just thinking, Karina, I don't know how relevant this is in terms of, you know, the participants that we have, but I suppose it's just about kind of what behaviours are we working with and what kind of labels they get. So I'm just wondering, in terms of young people that you're working with, is there any behaviours that you see that you know, or behaviours that they show in school when they're experiencing what they're experiencing, or when they're being stopped by the police? What kind of behaviours do you kind of see or hear about?
If I just jump in, I think most of the time it's acceptance, which is which is wild to me. But then at the same time, I remember being in that exact same position and just accepting it. So yeah, as much as behavioral action, I don't know how much acceptance comes under that as you know, a behavior. But yeah, it's definitely just accepting it, dismissing it. Yeah, I mean, some young people, after speaking at Kids of Colour, decide to, I guess, start making their own presentations and start talking about it a bit more, but they're not being given the correct platform to talk about them or present them to whoever they feel like they need to present it to. But yeah, it's definitely acceptance, I would say.
Can I ask, Lisa, when you say acceptance, how would that look to me? Like, is it almost a bit kind of like, I can't fight this, or is it?
It's more, okay, I've experienced this level of racism. I'm going to go and speak to a member of staff about it, and let them know that this is what's going on. And then the member of staff either attempting to pull people aside, but then all of a sudden, you know, that person that's experienced the racism is then seen as the aggressor. And then from there, it either becomes a situation where that young person then gives up, because obviously coming across as an aggressor, coming across as an aggressor obviously has more consequence than resolution. Or the other side of it is experiencing racism, going to a teacher, expressing what's gone on, and then nothing being done about it to the scale that they feel should have been done about it. So they leave the situation and then just carry on about their business, or just feel like, okay, racism's going to happen and I've got no one to turn to within my institution. So they block it out, or try to block it out.
Right.
Yeah.
And I guess the important thing, Lisa, is that all of those strategies work, don't they? For each of those young people, they've got to find a way that enables them to continue to be in that school or in that community. And I guess sometimes it's about, when we're looking at the behaviours, it's about, why is it being presented in this way, and how does it enable that young person, you know, to survive, almost, to manage on a daily basis what is happening in their lives. And I just think it's interesting that for some it is just acceptance, for some it's just dismiss it, and for some who try to take action, if they're not being heard, then where else do you go? And that kind of sense that until they see other people finding a resolution, how do they then believe that they can get a resolution? So I think that there's something about us seeing that the behaviours at times can feel frustrating because what is happening is wrong, but it's almost about, how do we accept that actually sometimes fighting constantly can be exhausting. So there has to be other ways of being able to kind of look after yourself, you know, especially, you know, as children, when they're perhaps feeling those adults aren't caring for them. And I know we're talking, you know, specifically of school experiences, but like Katrina said, if you then layer that with things that may happen in the community, you then layer that with things that may be happening at home, you know, there's quite a lot that a young person is having to manage for their daily survival, you know.
Are there any other?
Yeah, and I was just going to say, and I think this is particularly important for us as well, kind of going forward, because it feels like COVID has really gotten in the way of some of our outreach work with young people, and for the last year there's been a real block in terms of some of that more in-depth work that we might have with young people, or conversations that we have. And so I think also why this question feels difficult for us to answer is because our work has been so restricted in terms of the depth of conversation that we have with young people, or the variety of spaces that we have these conversations. So it feels like we're not in a position where we know young people who are coming to us enough to know what's going on at home and in the community. So I think this is really important for us to kind of understand that lens of going into the conversations we're having currently, but also going forward once COVID once we're managing it differently and we're more back to our work with young people, it would be really helpful to understand some of this as well, because I think we often get quite get to the kind of surface of things in our interactions at the moment, because it feels like there's a restriction on how we can engage with young people, and it's online, and you know, so
and you know what, Chloe, I think Katrina's going to talk about some behaviours in a minute. I think when you hear these behaviours, I think if we had potentially those school teachers or those police officers here, this is how they may describe those young people. And I think when young people are coming for you for support, they potentially give a different presentation because you're the safe adult. And that's one of the biggest things that we want to talk about today is, as youth workers, why is it sometimes that we can hear about a child being described and we think, that's not the child we see, you know, that's not, you know, and sometimes it's a shock to hear the behaviour, because you think, no, we don't get that. And I think there's something about that's really important about as youth workers. It's back to that safe adult, that safe space, someone who believes, someone who the young person knows, trusts them, and that they can trust. And I think that often that's why sometimes we haven't, those behaviours don't just roll off our tongue because we don't necessarily see them. And, you know, I see it a lot, you know, where I am now at 42nd Street. You know, we don't have young people kicking off. We don't, you know, we hear that language, but within our organisation, we don't see that. It's not because we're a magical organisation, but there's something about what are we giving? What are we saying to young people when they walk through our doors? And my sense is that's something similar that kids of colour also give. And I think just by the very fact that they can call you when those issues are going on means that already they know you believe them and you know what they're going through and what they're describing is wrong, and you will support that, you know.
Yeah, and I can anticipate what some of the behaviours are going to pop up are, and I think this is also interesting for us in that when we are delivering our anti-racist training and how people's racist thoughts interact with these behaviours, and then therefore how they might see Black young men or Black young women, for example, presenting with such behaviours and really not even being able to see it through a trauma-informed lens because they're actually seeing it through the lens of racism, and therefore, you know, even further putting that young person in a box inside a box without the ability to see actually this young person is experiencing trauma. So yeah, I think that's a really important point, Karina.
And I really like what you said, Chloe, because what I'm hearing is that you already see behind the behaviour, and I and that's why you probably have a very different experience of the young people you work with, is because you're seeing behind the behaviour. And I think that's what we do at 42. You know, when young people are getting referred, going, they've got anger management issues, we're like, right, okay, well, that they're trying to communicate something. So if they are angry at school, they're trying to communicate something. So actually, what is it that they need to communicate? What is it that they want to communicate? And empowering them to communicate it in a way where they're not showing it in an angry way by, you know, I don't know, throwing a chair or something. It's about kind of going, actually, what's really going on underneath that. And I think that's one of the kind of power of probably the work that we all do, which is, you know, I think probably from our own experiences, but also understanding young people through the lens of trauma. We're not reacting to that behavior. You know, if they say, oh, well, you know, I ended up kicking off at school because, again, the teacher didn't listen to me. Well, well, yeah, you know, I would, you know, as an adult, I'd be like, I'm not being listened to, you know, and you are going to have an angry reaction. That's one of the ways that we say there's a threat here and you're not listening. I need to show you. So I really like what you said, Chloe, about that, because it just sounds like you're already coming into it with really understanding young people's behaviours and really understanding young people's reactions to racism. Okay, so can I just ask, what kind of labels do you hear from other professionals around the young people that you're working with?
I think it's interesting, I think, for me, because some of my work, I think in training, people are they're already in a position, and most people in our training are white, so I think they're already in a position of being quite reserved about what they share in terms of how they interact with their young people. So it isn't always a space that feels like people would be totally honest, because I think being in a space where people reflect on their behavior brings up some shame for people. So I think there's also a reserve there as to say how they really have spoken about young people. But I don't know, Fozia, Leah, Maya, you've been in more trainings than me, so you might have heard more people be looser with what they share, but yeah, for me that's been quite limited, and I think it's because people are feeling embarrassed in that moment to really share how they talk about those young people. But you can see, something I've noticed is that you can see that when we talk about you know, for example, racism being like even just racial language being, what's the word we use? It's gone out of my head now. But you can see that there's almost like a distance between believing that what we're saying is impacting young people in this way. So I think for us, if we said in our training, and we say something very similar actually, isn't like racism is trauma for young people, or racism is, oh, the word's really gone, but you know, using words like that, you can sometimes see that people in training are like, but really is it? Because they have such a surface level understanding of how racism and how them as people in the institutions not supporting young people is impacting on them. So I think I experience it more of that disbelief that this is impacting young people, rather than people being very open with the words that they use.
Okay, so it sounds almost like what you're experiencing is almost, like you said, that kind of that disbelief. And I suppose I'm just thinking there's a process there that will happen for the young people then, which is, well, when you're coming to me saying I'm being racially abused at school, there's a disbelief there that it's actually impacting, and it's not really that big, which is possibly why there's a lot of dismissiveness and kind of, you know, oh yeah, I'll speak to them, but nothing really happens. It sounds like it's almost like you're seeing it in the training room and you're going, I can understand what's happening in the schools then, or the police.
Some example of language that I feel like we've come across, and one more recently was like describing groups of children of colour as being difficult, and that was specifically said in relation to talking about racial segregation in a school. And the idea was that like, oh, but they're just really difficult, and they're not being around people that look like them and have grown up in a similar environment, because they're using that as a safety net, because they might have experienced things with different groups of people that have been difficult, but instead it's like those boys are difficult, they're which I just thought was really interesting. And well, not when I say interesting, I mean like a really negative way to look at that situation, because it's completely shutting down like that the environment that they're in has anything to do with the fact that they're looking for people that are like them. Another one that has definitely come up a couple of times is like loud or outspoken, and that's often used specifically in relation to children, like students flagging instances of like racism, which is a very familiar stereotype about, you know, that the angry black girl. I think I've mainly heard that being used about girls of color, but I know that it's also language used around other young people as well. So yeah, those are two that I can think of, but there's definitely sort of words that are very similar to those two that have come up before in workshops and stuff.
So what I'm hearing is that it's young people are being described as difficult, they're being described as loud and outspoken, and like you said, you know, it's almost like code for, you know, the angry black woman thing. And you know, so what I'm wondering though is, how does that feel for you as workers to hear professionals talking about young people in that way?
I mean, for me anyway, and people might feel differently about this, it's very frustrating, because it feels like a very easy way to sort of like shut down conversations about why students are acting in a certain way. Like as we've spoken about, like, you know, often these are trauma-informed responses or are like ways to try and protect themselves. So it feels really frustrating that like staff members in particular, people who are supposed to be there to support and help growth, are really have a very limited understanding about this behaviour, and about why they might be expressing themselves in the way that they are, and also not listening to them, like just being like, oh, she is very loud or she is very outspoken, almost as a way to brush off the things a student might be going through.
So they really make it about the young person, don't they? As opposed to the issue, they make it about the young person. Any other feelings from you know, for you in terms of how you feel about these labels that are put on young people?
I think for me, there's like two different sides, kind of like what Chloe was saying in our workshop. When we do our anti-racist work, there's this kind of not wanting to admit maybe words that they use instead to describe young people, but then speaking with young people, or even through the report of the no policing, there's a lot of microaggressions that are used to describe them or to label them that always have negative connotation. And it could come from anything. There was a young person who her teacher kind of implied might be involved in a gang because she was wearing a bandana, or speaking outspokenly and making it seem by expressing yourself then you're aggressive to a young Black person. So when I've spoken to or worked with young people, there's a lot of microaggressions that come out that sometimes they don't really know how to take, especially from adults that they're supposed to trust and feel comfortable with, like your teacher. Like, you don't think, oh, my maths teacher is going to be racist to me today as a 12-year-old. Like, that's not what goes through your mind. And I think it's very hard for young people to understand microaggressions as well. I mean, it took me a long time to understand what microaggressions were. And so yeah, it's very frustrating then to be in workshops at times with some, you know, our anti-racist workshops, and then there's this sort of dismissive, like, not understanding of the impacts of these words and the connotations that they have, or not having this sort of honest conversations to be like, oh, I didn't realize before, but now I can identify that I've actually made that mistake. Like, you know, to have something progressive. So yeah, like Maya said, it can be very frustrating and infuriating because it feels a bit like a stampede, especially because these people have direct contact a lot of the times with young people. But yeah, those are like themes that have come up when
and the reason I'm asking you that is because this is us as adults talking about how we feel, how professionals are speaking about these young people, and then you've got young people that will be feeling exactly the way that we're feeling. They'll be feeling that frustration. They'll be feeling that kind of like, what is it that I need to do? You know, I think, you know, someone mentioned earlier that kind of powerlessness and things like that. And what I'd say as well is that a lot of our young people don't have the language sometimes. You know, if you think about emotional literacy and stuff, you know, our young people don't have that. So they can't, or may not even feel, you know, in this situation, I wonder whether actually they feel like they can say, I'm really frustrated with the lack of action to a teacher. You know, I know that I couldn't do that at 15. So, you know, I'm just thinking about the young people. So one, you know, it's that kind of struggle around, you know, being able to articulate it. But what I'm hearing as well for your, you know, in terms of your young people, is that emotional language might not even be met, and they might just be further just kind of going, well, you're just being an angry, you know, young person, as opposed to actually I'm articulating myself. And so what I'd want to say as well is that sometimes what we've got is young people who are feeling these feelings, and because they don't have the language, and I think what you do is provide that language, but young people don't have that language, and sometimes that's what we'll see in the behavior. You know, young people will show us the frustration, they will show us that kind of, just that real kind of infuriating, you know, I'm sick and tired of this, I'm sick and tired of the school not acting, I'm sick and tired of being stopped and searched, you know, I'm sick and tired of watching over my back, you know, when I'm walking around in the community. You know, it's things like that I think young people are going to be really kind of sometimes not be able to show, not being able to articulate that. So therefore they might show it in their behavior. And I think that's just about us, you know, the purpose of this exercise really is just to kind of go, you know, we want to see beyond the behavior. That's one of the trauma-informed ways that we can work, is seeing beyond the behavior.
Yeah, and then just on that, there was something that I remember Roxy telling us, because part of the reason why we really wanted to be more trauma-informed is because of the work that we do advocating for young people in the police. And there was an incident last year when a family had called us because the police had been called to arrest a young person. And the young person's behaviour, I can imagine the police were thinking, you know, that they were sat on the fence when the police came, and they were, I think, trying to put a front of, like, you know, distancing from what was happening. But actually, you know, what Roxy, when she was relaying that situation back to us, was saying, actually, that young person was scared. You know, the police had come to arrest them. I think they were 14. But the police didn't have the ability to see that young black man as a vulnerable, scared young person, because they've already labelled them as somebody who's committed a crime, first of all, so they're a criminal, and all the rest that comes with their, you know, with what they're putting onto him as being a young black man. And instead of in that, and which is why it was great that Roxy could be there, because advocacy between the police and the young person to say, well, actually, you know, please step back. I need to have a space where I can talk to this young person, and we can actually have that conversation, rather than this interaction where that young person's upset emotions and feeling of being scared is never going to be met by the police, and never going to have compassion from the police. And in that situation, I think if Roxy wasn't there, it could have escalated into, well, actually, that young person knows that showing the police that you're upset and scared isn't gonna, they're not going to care about that, you know. And often then being defensive or angry or those kind of emotions come out, because we learn to do those. We don't, you know, we don't have space to be sad and vulnerable. So yeah, it's I think in times like that, it's frustrating, because knowing that the police aren't seeing that vulnerability means that this person could get arrested, this person could get XYZ punishments that are not fair. And I think some of that powerlessness and frustration we feel as workers, because it's like, if you could just see this young person's emotions.
I guess the reality is as well is that our communities have many stories that show that things can end quite badly.
Yeah.
It might be a father, it might be a brother, it might be a sister, a mother, and therefore, you know, that gets, that fear is in all of the children and young people in the community, because they're aware that actually bad things can happen. You know, that just being a child isn't enough to stop anything happening. And I think it's interesting. I'm going to link in Lisa's point here, which Lisa said is, can we talk about the power dynamic that also has an impact? And again, you know, even if you just look at the power dynamic of an adult and a child, and then you layer on top of that a police officer and a child, and then you lay on top of that the power dynamic of a white police officer and a black child, and already that, you know, that power dynamic is definitely in favour of the adult, isn't it? And already the reaction of that child, that you know, they're going to try and be very thoughtful of every reaction they're going to make, because of the fear that's going to come with all of that, the fear of that knowledge of, I don't have any power, you know. And one of the things you all talked about at the very beginning of the of this discussion was powerlessness, you know, that some of these young people feel, and it's real. We know that it's real, you know.
I also wanted to add on there, because I think, as much as, you know, in most cases you do find that young people don't have that sort of emotional literacy, but there are a surprising number that do, and are able to, you know, it should be enough to say to a member of staff, a teacher, or whoever it may be, that this is right, this is wrong, I am happy, I am sad. Like, do you know what I mean? You shouldn't have to use, you know, monotonous forms of language to articulate what's good and what's bad. And I think a lot of the time with some of the young people that we do speak to, it's hard to express this, because one, I've also been there, and it takes so much courage to eventually go up to a teacher or go up to a police officer and say, this is happening, this is right, this is wrong. So I know that a lot of people of colour, especially Black students, before they even take that step, they've rehearsed it, they've rehearsed the conversation, they've thought about the conversation, they've thought about how left the conversation can go and how right the conversation can go, before they actually get to that point of, okay, I'm about to initiate this conversation with whoever it may be. So in situations like that, it's you know, I guess coming back onto the question that you asked initially, how do you support them young people that are emotionally intelligent and do express themselves accordingly, but because of the power dynamic, either end up in a position where the script gets flipped, and then they're pushed into the circumstance where they do seem like the aggressor, they do seem like the angry Black woman, or they do seem like the problematic Black boy, when initially that was never them, and that was never the case.
Yeah. So we're going to go into kind of regulation in a bit in terms of what's happening in the brain and things like that, so that you'll probably get a bit more of a kind of understanding of empowering young people to regulate. Because you're right, Lisa, you know, you've articulated what's happening, and then the teacher's just kind of dismissing it, or they're making you out to be the aggressor. You're going to go into your fight or flight, you know, or possibly you freeze, you know, and we'll talk about that a bit more in a bit. Okay. The reason why we've got this up is just to kind of, I feel like you...
Sorry, Katrina, can I just say, sorry, I'm just really aware of time. We've got about 32 minutes and we've got quite a lot to get through. Yeah, we finished at 11:30, is that right?
All right, yes.
Do you want to kind of do this as a bit of a teaching session for the next bit, just so we can start getting through? Because I'm just aware we've spent a lot of time talking, which is really important. But I think that what I'm hearing as well is that the candidates want to do some learning as well.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Okay.
Let's start teaching.
So yeah, so this is about kind of, it sounds like you all get it anyway. It's about kind of looking at what you're seeing. You know, the iceberg is what you can see above the water, and it's about kind of recognizing actually what's going on for the young person underneath that. Yeah, so they might show the behavior because they kind of think, well, I don't know how to show that I'm panicked. I don't know how to show that I'm numb. I don't know how to show I'm confused. So they'll show a different behavior. Yeah, and it's a very good survival strategy that we all have. When especially when we're faced with threats. Okay, so let's look at the behaviors through our attachment lens. Okay, so stop sharing.
Babies this young
Can everyone hear that?
are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, come on, why aren't we doing this? Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
Okay. Any thoughts, any feelings that came up watching that video?
It was quite hard to watch when she was flat-faced, like the attempts that the baby was trying to do to get their attention and nothing. And it's similar to something that a friend of mine who's a parent, learned about crying, and that she was saying that when a baby cries, and we've been taught as parents to see some of that crying as tantruming, so we ignore it, rather than the thing that the baby's crying about going away, actually the baby just learns to numb the sensation. So it's kind of, it made me think in this instance, or with some of the young people that we work with, it's like, actually, when you're calling out for your attention, your needs to be met, and trying to communicate what's going on for you, and met with nothing, or met with being told off, or met with further abuse, you just learn to suppress, or you learn to numb. So it kind of made me think about this baby, like if that had have continued going on, and that baby had have continued to cry, like what would have happened if the parent still continued to have that flat reaction? Would the baby have just learned that crying isn't going to go anywhere, so I'll just try and shush that feeling? So yeah, it was quite hard to watch for that reason, because it's just sad, isn't it, that that's playing out for us in young people. And
yeah, definitely. It was a similar thought for me, was, you know, these are teachers that are just not reacting, and what does that do to young people? I don't know why it's stuck.
Any thoughts about
These people
trying to get it unstuck? Any thoughts around that?
Yeah, just the same as how Chloe felt, really. I think I like covered my face at some point, because I was just like, oh no, that's really sad, like don't do that, don't ignore the little baba. But yeah, it's just wild that if things like that are picked up at an infant stage, imagine how sort of like, well, not grown-ups, but you know, when you're in your teenage stage, where you can actually talk, and you can actually, you know, say how you feel, but you're then not given the agency to do so. So you do end up resorting back to a more physical way of reacting. Just like the baby started using her physical body to react to the blankness that she was receiving. So it's interesting how language helps, but you always resort back to a physical response.
Definitely.
I guess the important thing to remember is that, again, as I was saying earlier about the different layers that young people are dealing with and managing, some of the young people that you'll be supporting will have had that experience as babies and as children. You know, we know that parental mental health can be a big issue. We know that drugs and alcohol can be a big issue in children's lives, domestic violence, things like that. So they have been taught from that very early age about how their behaviour will be reacted to or not. You know.
So I just want to kind of take this a bit further in terms of a disorganized attachment disorder. So there's different types of attachment, and what I'd encourage you to do is kind of, if you wanted a bit more information about that, is there is some training around 42nd Street offer it, but also there'll be some training with the City Council as well. But this is a disorganized attachment, and this is a particular attachment where, you know, the parenting is so inconsistent. Okay, so what I want you to think about is that kid, you know, they've got a need, you know, in the baby in the video. I'd probably say that the need there was that they were feeling alone. You know, mum was detached, and therefore they were feeling alone. But obviously babies have other needs, you know, hunger, pain, alone, thirsty, yeah? So what babies do then, which is what that baby did, you know, started to cry, to be a bit clingy, you know, seek closeness, hit and shout. And what we're talking about here is what happens when the parent carer doesn't respond to those needs. Yeah. So it's really normal for a child to feel hunger, pain, you know, be thirsty, all that kind of stuff. It's really normal for the child to go, I've not got the words to say I'm hungry. So what I'll do is I'll show you by crying, you know, like what you said, Chloe. But then what happens is if the parent carer is frightening, so, you know, if they're like, what do you want now? And, you know, shouting and everything else, or, you know, abusive and they're hitting them or things like that, or there's just no response, you know, so that, you know, that parent just went into that no response, or no consistency. So what if you've like 1 minute, yeah, I'll change your nappy, and then 1 minute, I'm just going to leave you in it for 3 days. It's that lack of consistency as well. And there's never any repair. Yeah. So the thing that we can do when it comes to attachment is we can, you know, parents aren't perfect. So, you know, it's about being able to repair. So if you shout at your child and you just think, you know what, I've just had a really crappy day at work, I'm frustrated, and then my child needs me, I've shouted at them, you can repair that, you can soothe them. If it's a baby, you'll maybe pick them up, you might explain it to them if they're a bit older, that kind of stuff. But what happens if that just continues and there's never a repair? Think about the internal working model of a child then, yeah? They're going to start to be thinking, I'm unworthy of care and to be loved, yeah? Why would you trust that you're worthy of love when you're not being given that? I am bad, powerful, and unsafe, yeah? Think about if you think that as a baby, that when you cry, your mum starts crying and, you know, they're really struggling and everything else, the baby then thinks, well, I'm powerful enough to make my mum cry. I'm powerful enough to make my dad shout. God, very aware that's very gendered at that point. But, you know, it's about kind of, you know, a baby, a child, then really starting to think, oh, actually, maybe I've caused the mental health problems for my parents. Maybe I've caused the DV. Maybe I've caused, you know, my parent to lose it to the point where they've hit me. I'm powerful, yeah. I must control when I'm distressed. So Chloe, going back to you, you know, that numbness that you talked about, it's that the child will then start to go, it's not safe for me to be able to show how I'm feeling. It's not safe for me to have needs. So therefore I must control it. And ultimately what you learn then as well is relationships aren't to be trusted. Yeah. So then we go into a child that lacks emotion. So again, back to what you said, Chloe, the child will then just detach and just be like, okay, me crying does not help. I'll just hopefully, if I'm quiet, you know, one of my carers will meet my need. Yeah. But what they also realize is that I can't have any needs of my own. So my need for playing with Lego today is not important. It's about making sure mum or dad are okay. Yeah. Then what happens is it's that frozenness, it's that watchfulness. Yeah. So think about, you know, I mentioned before about, you know, young people being in the community and feeling that watchfulness around police, and also that kind of social isolation, just withdrawing and just kind of thinking, actually, I don't need it. And that's when we go to the, obviously that's the trauma that we're talking about that young people experience. Okay. So if you were dealing with a young person who has an insecure attachment, yeah, what their internal working model is, so this is how they see the world, they will see you as scary or abusive, potentially, or they'll see teachers as scary or abusive, or, you know, any kind of adults in their life. They'll presume that the adults won't respond to their needs, or that they'll be unpredictable with it. Yeah. No one is available for me. No one's emotionally or physically available. So they'll just see adults as like, well, they're not really going to meet my need. Yeah. Adults hurt me, adults get angry, and they're also overwhelmed by me. Yeah. So think about how powerful that is in terms of how young people will start to see, or children, young people, how they'll start to see adults. Yeah. And this is based on obviously their early life experiences. So in terms of how the young person will see themselves, it's all my fault. Yeah. I'm not wanted. I'm inadequate. I don't know how to protect myself. I can't be trusted. I am unsafe, powerful, and bad. Yeah. So what you might experience in terms of what the young person might be bringing is, You might feel a little bit confused by the behavior at times. Yeah, you might feel a bit kind of, controlled or manipulated. And what that is, manipulation's got quite a powerful kind of attachment to it. But what I hear what I'm seeing when a young person, when I'm feeling a little bit manipulated, they don't know how to ask for what they need, so they'll find a way of getting it. So I think it's really important that we, again, we see behind what the young person is doing. You may feel like you don't understand what's going on at times, or be able to connect with that young person, because because they see adults are so scary. Their ability to connect to you won't be there, so your ability to connect with them might feel quite difficult. And you might feel useless and angry because you're just thinking, I don't know how to help you. You're being faced with so much from the young person that you just think, I don't know how to help you. You might see bizarre behavior where you're thinking, I don't understand what's going on here. And again, you may not know where behaviors come from. Okay, so this is something that you might experience with a young person who's got a disorganized attachment. So we're talking young people that might have experienced quite severe levels of neglect, abuse, witnessed a lot of DV and seen kind of inconsistent caring. Potentially young people that have been like young carers. So it's not definitive that if you've experienced these that you have a disorganized attachment, but it's just being aware that these are the young people where their behavior is they're being labelled quite a lot at that point, in terms of when they're in your youth clubs or when they're in kind of schools and everything else. They're being labelled in a particular way because their behavior just feels kind of almost there's no rhyme or reason to it. Okay, any thoughts around that? No? Are we okay to crack on? Because I know that we're out of time.
We've got about 15 minutes left.
Yeah.
So I know the thing is, I did talk about us, having boundaries and making sure check with everybody that
Okay.
you think to carry on, or do you want to have a couple of minutes and then come back, grab a quick drink? What works?
I'm okay to carry on.
Yeah, same.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant.
Is that okay?
Okay. So this section is the importance of understanding the brain and the nervous system. Okay. So I think the best way to describe what's happening in the brain, and especially if we want to do some education with young people, Dan Siegel, who I mentioned earlier, he does a really good kind of uses his hand basically to describe what's going on in the brain. So I'm going to take you through a day-to-day scenario of how the brain works, but then I'll bring that scenario into potential trauma. Yeah. Okay, so you've got your hand. Yeah. This part of the brain deals with your breathing, your heart rate, and things like that. Yeah. And you've got this part of the brain here, and that's the limbic brain. And that's the part of the brain that deals with emotions. Yeah. It deals with connections, emotions, attachments, that kind of thing. Yeah. This part of the brain is probably the one that's engaged right now with learning, using your resources, being able to provide empathy, being able to understand connections, and being able to be compassionate, logical thinking, so maths and things like that. Yeah. So imagine you're driving your car. Yeah. So this part of the brain will just be concentrating on your breathing, concentrating on your heart rate, and obviously being able to kind of move your eyes and things like that. All the things that that you need to do to be able to drive a car. Yeah, the unconscious stuff. Yeah. This part of the brain is dealing with maybe the scenery that's around you. So if you're driving through the countryside and it's a lovely sunny day and things like that, this part of the brain will be taking that in and going, oh, it's lovely, and having a positive sensation around what you're experiencing. Or in my case, really good tunes on and I'm just happy because it's like, oh yeah, I get to sing along and things like that. Yeah, that's the limbic brain. And this part of the brain is figuring out if I'm going to get there on time. Do I need to turn left? You know, obviously listening to the sat nav and things like that. If there's a sign saying, you know, you need to go down to 30, this is the part of the brain that will be taking that in. Yeah. Okay. So if we were driving along, yeah, and a white van comes along and cuts us up, yeah, this part of the brain will be like, brake, yeah. But what will happen is that the limbic brain might send a message as well of going, you know, they were wrong for, I was going to use different language then, that they were wrong for doing that, and you might get a bit angry and you might beep your horn, or you might say a few kind of choice words. But then what will happen is, you know, the threat's gone, the white van's gone, and you're going back to normal, and this part of the brain is engaged. You might process that and go, yeah, you know, they were such and such for doing that, yeah. But what happens if you have an accident, yeah? Then what might happen is you've had the accident, you know, obviously that can be traumatic in itself. But then you know, the next day you're going into your car and all of a sudden this part of the brain is going, that I associate that with pain. I associate that with a lot of fear. So what it does is it sends the message to the brain, to the lower part of the brain, and it sends information all through the nervous system going. And what you might do is feel anxiety. Yes, you might feel anxious about getting in that car. You might get in the car but feel anxious when you see a white van. Yeah. So the triggers can be varied depending on who you are. Yeah. But what happens is let's say you feel like you can't get in the car. Yeah. So then you're ringing sick to work because you need your car to get to work, but you're ringing sick. But then the next day comes and you still can't get in the car because your anxiety is so overwhelming. And, you know, I'm going to paint a really bleak picture now, but, you know, you get, you know, potentially you lose your job, you know, you need to pay your next mortgage payment. What you might do then is feel so overwhelmed. You can't fight what's going on. You can't fight what's going on. And you become so overwhelmed that you freeze, you collapse, you kind of just shut down then. And that's maybe when you might see that you're, you know, in bed a bit more, or you're a bit detached from things, and your ability to problem solve is gone because you're just kind of like, I don't know how to, you feel so overwhelmed. When you're in the freeze point, this part of the brain literally has very little activity going on. Yeah. So your ability to problem solve, it gets really knocked off. Yeah. Does that make sense in terms of the different parts of the brain? Yeah. Do you have any questions about that? No? Okay. So if we were to think about a situation that you've talked about before around a young person who uses this part of the brain and go, right, you know what we're told is that we go and speak to the teacher, yeah? But they've already had this experience where their emotional brain is dealing with that as well. The emotional brain is like, how dare you talk to me like that? How dare you, be racist, I suppose, you know, it's a bit, you know, how dare you sort of thing. So this is the limbic brain where it's kind of like that, it's not okay, yeah? But what the young person does, and to their credit, they go, right, okay, this part of the brain goes, okay, this is what I know what to do. This is the resources that I need to use, which is to go and speak to a teacher, yeah? So then you go and do that, and then what the teacher does is dismiss you, or like you have said, they've made you out to be the aggressor, yeah? What can then happen is the young person then, as Dan Siegel would say, is flip the lid, yeah? So this part of the brain is no longer engaged, yeah? So Chloe, when you talked about the situation where the young person was at the house, and was it Roxy had gone over, and, you know, what she was probably able to see is that this young person's they're just in the limbic brain, in that lower part of the brain that's going fight, flight, freeze. Yeah, there's a threat coming towards them, and need to act. Yeah, and the act would be the anger or the anxiety. And it sounds like this young person was really, really scared. Yeah. So what the idea is that we build young people's ability to regulate. So what we do is the bottom part of the brain is where it's kind of like, okay, and it almost going back to safety, being able to kind of calm the nervous system down. So that's the point where we'd regulate. Yeah. So there's particular exercises that we can do. And I suppose what I'd say as well is this part of the brain that deals with the fight, flight and freeze, that's the first part of the brain that's developed. Yeah. So what we do is we work with the first part of the brain that's developed and move up. Yeah. So what you do is a lot of the work around kind of that, you do a lot of the work around kind of relating. So you really validate young people's experiences, and you do a lot of the kind of, okay, what can we do? So you're dealing with the two other parts of the brain. What I think Roxy did that day was probably be that kind of safe adult, and, kind of almost create like a bit of a barrier between the police officer and the young person. And what that potentially, I don't know what the situation, but potentially that would have helped the young person regulate, because it would have been like, right, okay, there's a safe person here. And in terms of regulation, think about go back to the baby, go back to, when the mother then starts reacting again, the baby was then able to regulate, the baby was then able to engage back with mum. We're all safe adults in young people's lives. So just by being that safe adult, your presence alone can be enough. Yeah. That's the power of connection. That's the power of what we do as youth workers. Your presence there and it can be enough. Yeah. But what you can also do is help the young person, maybe, think, kind of focus on something else. So it might be about breathing. There's particular breathing techniques that are in the paper around kind of being able to regulate the nervous system. But it might be about getting the young person, a cup of tea, or like, any kind of hot drink, something that can activate their senses. If you think about how we take in threats, it's through the 5 senses. So anything sensory will help that young person. So if they can see you, great. If they can taste something, great. If they can hear something different, and what that might be in the situation with that you talked about with Roxy, it might have been that we say, can this young person go to another room, so that Roxy's dealing with with the police officer, and this young person is almost taken away from that quite traumatizing situation. So being able to hear something, we know whenever I do safety plans with young people, what I always hear is the importance of music in young people's lives. And what you're doing is essentially you're giving them something different to hear. You're giving the brain something different to process that feels more pleasurable, which means that the limbic brain is kind of like, oh, okay, maybe things aren't as bad as I think they are. Yeah. Other senses, touch. So, if they've got like a favorite jumper, or, a heavy blanket and things like that. I mean, I know it depends on the scenario and where you're at and everything, but, it's things like, if you're saying to a young person, do you have a favorite, necklace? I have a necklace that I tend to wear sometimes. And it's quite a smooth stone on it. And it just, when I'm working with young people sometimes, and I can see that they're dysregulated, I'll just make sure that I'm touching that, because then it just takes me a little bit out of my own kind of dysregulation. Okay, so using the 5.
I guess that's the other important thing, isn't it, Katrina, is what is important is how you are reacting as well, because the reality is you may also be experiencing that really difficult situation, but the young person is watching you, and not that we want you to be a robot or to not react in any way, but it's thinking about, well, what is my role in this situation? And if it's there to support and protect the young person, then it's about doing that in a way that can help to regulate and not escalate. And I know that can be challenging, but it's about let's regulate and not escalate.
Yeah. I suppose it goes back to, in terms of what Karina was saying, it's going back to that safe adult. I know that I'm not safe with young people if I'm dysregulated, because I'm anxious. And what happens is that when I'm dysregulated, I'm losing connection with the young person. That's what happens. That's what trauma is. It's a loss of connection with you and your emotions and what you're feeling, and you need to repair, and you need to be able to act and things like that. It takes you away from that. So I think, being able to connect and be, so I think in terms of, the regulation stuff, it's really important that us as adults, focus on our own regulation. So focus on things that, you know, like I said, I've got a necklace that I generally wear, but things like breathing, you know, just kind of checking in with yourself, you know, before you go into a situation, check in and go, right, okay, I just need to make sure that I'm calm, because that will help a young person feel calm. Okay.
Trina, I'm just aware that we're 3 minutes to 11:30.
Yeah.
I'll put in a chat asking if people could stay for another 10-15 minutes. Are you okay continuing on as well? But we will have to finish kind of then. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're okay with that as well. I think people have said that they're okay. So
Yeah. Okay. So we're looking at 1:45.
at the latest, yeah.
Yeah. So can we change the brain? Yeah. So like I said, relationships build the brain. So it's about us understanding the importance of what we provide for young people that will help young people heal. So even the fact that you bring young people together maybe to talk about what's going on, that in itself will be healing for young people, because it's about kind of going, it's not just me. Yeah. And I think that's the real power of, you know, I know from Facebook, what you do is you bring young people together to talk about things. That in itself will be powerful, but you being the safe adult for those young people is powerful as well. Yeah. I can imagine you offer lots of compassion for the young person in terms of how they're feeling, how they may be acting. You know, sometimes it'll be that thing of like, you know, I know that, you know, I remember one of my friends losing it at work, and she was like, I just feel like I perpetuated the stereotype of being an angry Black woman. And it was like, no, there was a good reason why you were angry. This isn't about you perpetuating a stereotype. This is actually, there was a really good reason why you were angry. So I think it's about offering that real compassion and real understanding of why young people feel the way they feel about their experiences. And just remember that, you know, and especially with the young age group that we work with, you know, young people's brains, they're not formed fully until they're 25. So what you've got is this part of the brain that is still building, which means that if you're providing them with more information, and you're getting them to talk about things more, it means that this part of the brain can communicate with this part of the brain better, because you've given this a lot of information and you've gone, so this part of the brain, it's almost like, you know, think of it as like a little relationship. This part of the brain, you know, is going, I'm so frigging angry. And this part of the brain is going, yeah, and it's okay to be angry. Let's think about how we want to express that though. So it might be that, you know, like, I think it's great that young people have come to you independently and gone, this is what's going on in school. That shows that part of the brain is kind of going, I'm feeling this, but this is what I'm going to do with it. Yeah. And all we're doing is building that for young people. Okay.
And I guess just to add to that, really, I think this very much links in with the hope again, because I think sometimes people feel that, like, especially when we're looking at things like attachment, that, oh, well, that happened when you were a baby, nothing can be changed. And, you know, I just want to reiterate what Katrina said. Our brains are still developing up to our, you know, mid to late 20s. And what we got to remember is that there's hope, that we can change those patterns, we can bring that safety in, we can bring a different way of working, we can begin to challenge that trauma, because I think if we don't have that hope, then we can't do the work. And I think young people also need to understand that, you know, even if they've had a traumatic life, that it doesn't mean they have to take that into adulthood in the same way. So it's about just holding on to that hope.
Yeah. And just to say as well, you know, if you're over 25, you know, your brain can still, you know, we've got all that plasticity.
Of course.
You know, so just so you know, it doesn't just stop. Okay, so this part of the session is about kind of looking at compassion fatigue. So what I want to do is explain what compassion fatigue is, and then what I think would be really good is if we talked about how we look after ourselves on an individual basis, but also as an organisation. So compassion fatigue, it's the emotional and physical exhaustion leading to diminished ability to empathise or feel compassion for others, often described as the negative cost of caring. Okay, the best way I was listening to a TED talk recently, and I thought this is a really good way of explaining it. So, you know, you've got a friend it's not they're in a relationship that's not particularly healthy, and they come to you and they're like, they come to me and they go, Katrina, I've left them, and I'm like, oh, that must be so hard, but well done, and all this kind of stuff. I'm here, ring me anytime, I'm here, sort of thing. And you're like really invested in, because you think, God, they've gone through a really hard breakup and everything else. And then 2 weeks later, they text you and they go, oh, I'm back with such and such. And you're like, all right, okay, da, da, da. And then, a couple of months later, they come back to you and they're like, I've broke up with them again. And, and you're like, yeah, that must be really difficult, but well done. And I'm here, ring me anytime, I've got you, and all this kind of stuff. And then we're talking a year later, and it's 5 times now that they've left their partner. And there's a point where you're kind of going, you start kind of looking at the phone and when they're ringing and going, I can't deal with this, and what's happened is that you've really invested this care for this friend. You've been there for them. You've listened to them. You've talked until midnight about what's going on and everything else, and talked about it's really good that you've left them and blah 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 and everything. But then this keep going back, and what's happened is that they're not invested in the care as much. They're not invested in changing that relationship enough, but you are. So that's why you're exhausted, and that's why you might get to the point where you're picking up your phone and just going, I can't deal with this. I'll speak to them when I've got a bit more energy or a bit more sort of thing, because and that's a really good example of compassion fatigue. Yeah. What I'd say is with young people that have been traumatized, yeah, is what you've got is sometimes their ability to look after themselves is diminished because of the trauma that they've been through. So what you're kind of met with sometimes is, look after me, I don't know how to do it for myself. Yeah. And what you're doing is you're giving and you're giving. Yeah. And young people are kind of going, because of their trauma, potentially they're saying, I just need you to keep giving. They've not built up the skills to be able to look after themselves. Yeah. So this is the work that we do, and what we talk about in the paper. So I'd really encourage you to read the paper. Is things that you can do to really kind of almost kind of recognize compassion fatigue, but also things that you can do to kind of make sure that you don't get to that point. But what I want to ask is, what is it you do already for yourselves to kind of look after yourselves? Because what I'm hearing is that young people are coming to you with experiences that you've had as well, which I can imagine is quite triggering. So I'm just wondering, in terms of for you, like, how do you look after yourselves, or how do you look after each other?
It's a really good question, Katrina. And actually, we're having a session this afternoon just on that, really, because it's been coming up
brilliant.
Even in our training, where we're feeling a sense of compassion fatigue for people we're training, actually, and also the impact that listening to things that are racist has on us. So so we might not already have the answers for that, but it is something that we're planning for after the session today, coincidentally.
Brilliant.
But one thing I think,
planned?
well, some of it is based on what we talk about in this session, but really just acknowledging how it makes us feel, what we can do as a team, what we do individually, and looking at building that sense of stuff we can go to. Something we have pretty much after every session is a space to debrief. So just talking about it, that's something that's quite standard. But in terms of building what we can do more, I'm hoping that's what we can explore this afternoon to see what works best for people.
Can I just share something, share my own experience, I guess, of kind of compassion fatigue? And I guess I just want to share it because I think that, Katrina mentioned earlier, she's been doing youth work for about 22 years. I think probably I'm similar, 2-3 decades of doing this kind of work. And I think that sometimes there's a sense that I should be able to do it, and I've chosen to do this. I should be, I can't say no to listening to that story, or I can't say no to that young person who needs just another 5 minutes of my time. And I guess what I want to share is, I started off my kind of youth work experience working at Rape Crisis Centre, and when you're continually hearing stories of trauma and abuse, even with lots of support in place, it begins to have an impact. And I did get to the point after 5 years where I thought, I can't hear any more stories like this. I just can't do it because it's just changing my whole view of the world. And I guess, you know, what I could have done was either A, deny it, or B, you know, go into collapse mode and maybe get quite depressed and get signed off work. But what I did was I decided to take action. I thought, right, I want to stay within this kind of work. So what I did was I handed in my notice and I decided to go to university and do my degree, etc., so that, you know, I could build myself up and go and do this work again, if that makes sense. So I guess I just wanted to share that, really, that it's all right. It's kind of a natural process. What we're hearing, we shouldn't be hearing it every day, but we do because of the work that we do. But we have to find ways to manage, and sometimes those ways are internal and the organisational. And I think it's great, Chloe, that Kids of Colour are looking at that. Sometimes it's external. You know, it's the little things that you might do, like, you know, make yourself, you know, a nice coffee, or, you know, make sure you catch up with a friend or do some yoga or whatever. But sometimes it's about maybe taking more direct action as well. And I just wanted to share that as kind of an older youth worker, kind of talking to some younger youth workers and saying it's all right to kind of think, you know what, I've had enough of this. I need to move on to something else, but still kind of, you know, have my passion of working with people, you know?
Yeah, and I think I really resonated with that sense of like feeling like you should be able to deal with this. And it's like, actually, yes, we have committed ourselves and we are passionate about, you know, wanting to change the worlds of young people, and via that, you know, holding our anti-racist training. So it feels like, oh, we're in this position, so we should be able to hear these things, but it doesn't change actually having to hear them, the impact it has on us. And yeah, sometimes that frustration or feeling of guilt, that it's like, oh, you know, I should be able to hear this and manage this, but actually I still feel annoyed or I still feel upset maybe, or so
and you will, Chloe. I think I think, you know, what I'd always say as well is, if you can't offer compassion to yourselves, it's going to be really hard to offer it to young people. So I think it's about being that real compassionate, you know, to yourselves. And you are hearing really difficult things, but I think, you know, firstly, you talked about that kind of microaggressions that you pick up on and things like that, which I think sometimes leaves us feeling a bit like, you know, did that really happen type thing? And, you know, we sometimes question ourselves, are we being oversensitive and things like that? But I think it's really good that we've got a name for it. I think it's really good that we can then provide that compassion for ourselves and say, actually, it's not okay that we're hearing this. It's not okay that when we're in training that, you know, workers are just kind of almost distancing themselves from something that actually they're perpetuating. So I think, yeah, you know, really, I'd really encourage you to be compassionate to yourselves. But I think, you know, just really reflect on what you do, just to look after yourselves. Things that bring you joy, you know, that could be, you know, through, you know, meditation. It could be through, like Karina said, yoga. It could be through, you know, chilling out with your mates when COVID clears up, you know. So I think it's about just kind of recognizing those things that really bring you a sense of joy, you know, kind of continue to do those outside of your work, because you need to know that you're bigger than that your life is bigger than your job, because what you're doing on a day-to-day basis is hard. So I'd really encourage you to look after yourselves. So we're coming to the end. Do you have any questions?
It's been quite a lot of information, hasn't there?
Yeah.
I guess that's the most important thing, is this has been a total whistle-stop tour. We've touched on trauma, we've touched on the brain, we've touched on attachment. This is just an acorn starting to, you know, develop your thinking, your growth, etc. And so we really will, you know, we really do encourage you to kind of start reading, continue reading, and just like we said before, be very curious about what's going on, and yeah, just keep enjoying what you're doing, but know that, yeah, it's a continual learning experience, isn't it? You know.
Yeah. One of the things that NYA have asked us to do is to ask you to put some feedback in the chat. So if you could maybe put something that you enjoyed and, you know, that you got from it, but also maybe something that you might change. that'd be really good, because it's all, you know, obviously we're always learning about how to deliver, you know, trauma training. So it'd be really good for, you know, if you've got any feedback about our presentation. I'm very aware of the fact that we've crossed time boundaries, everything, you know, we've not given you a break. So, you know, even if it's just things like that, then put that in there, that'd be great.
And can I just say, I know we've missed that slide, things to remember, but just do please have a look at it, because I think it's got some important points. Maybe it's something you can take into your next session, really. But I just think that there's some important points there that it's important to remember as youth workers as well. Especially, I think some of it fits in. I think, Lisa, you were talking about the power of the word trauma, and our experiences traumatic, and you know, it's about avoiding overusing that, and you know, things like that. So I just think if you get a chance, do please look at that as well, because I think it's important.
Okay. I'd just say thank you so much. Like, honestly, hearing the work that you do, but also kind of, you know, your understanding of the young people, it just warms my heart to kind of see that there's youth workers out there that just really understand young people and see beyond the behaviour. And you know, you definitely sound like safe adults for young people, which I think is what young people need, especially when they're experiencing racism. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you as well. It's been a really, really interesting session. So thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you. I really, really enjoyed it, and all the different sort of segments to it all.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I'm trying to type and say. I can't.
It's all right.
It's all right, type away.
Bev, is there anything you want to say before we kind of end?
I just wanted to say thank you both. That was absolutely fantastic. I knew it was a good idea getting 42nd Street in. Really, really useful, really insightful, and thanks to all you guys as well for participating. There's some really fascinating discussion there. I was gripped all the way through it. Just to reiterate, there is a paper and a podcast that are alongside this webinar, and they'll be, I think the paper's already on the website. If not, it'll be on imminently, and the podcast is coming up in the next week or so. So do keep checking back, because those resources that are going to be there forever, really. I mean, yeah, maybe not ever, but you know, long enough. And there are some other webinars that we've had in the past that are loaded up there, so you can check those out as well. And there's a couple more coming up in this series. So yeah, keep checking back on the website for stuff. But no, thanks, Karina. Thanks, Katrina. That was, yeah, really, really good. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, and I'm sure Kids of Colour will be in touch again, because I'm sure we're going to do some more work with you. So that'd be really good. Hopefully we'll see you in real time though, and not on
yeah. Thank you so much.
way.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, Kev.
Cheers, Karina. Thanks,
We'll see you
Katrina.
out.